thank you again, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. I know many of you probably just heard me talking about esports, but good news, you will not have to hear me for the course of this next hour. Instead, you're going to hear Scott Lewis. Scott is a partner at TNG Consulting. Some of you may know it better as ATIXA. Scott has served on the task force that created the United States Center for Safe Sport. And again, for those of you in the world of compliance and Title IX, you know all too well what that is. And served for a term as the acting chief officer for response and resolution. Scott works with college athletics departments and with the NCAA, and now I'm excited to share with the NJCAA and the USOC on sexual assault, abuse, harassment, bullying, and equity. He's an expert witness and litigation consultant in high-profile cases. And frankly, Scott, I could go on and on with Scott's bio, but in the interest of time, I want to make sure that I turn it over to Scott. Scott, really appreciate you joining us. Really appreciate the partnership and the opportunity for us to promote equity and inclusion and Title IX awareness throughout our membership.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it. And thanks, Mackenzie. I've got some slides, and I'm going to share them. So give me just one moment here. Reconfigure myself here. And in this days of COVID land, if any of you, we're doing this one meeting style, not webinar style. So if any of you want to make yourself be seen, that would be welcome. I always like to see who's in the room. And then I'm also going to say, if you have any questions as we go through this, I'm going to open up the chat. And come on, there we go. I see we got a fair number of participants in the room. So thanks for the intro. And if you want, I can certainly send this slideshow to Mackenzie so that if you have an interest, or you can email me and I'm happy to send it to you. And that'll work. Let me make this window a little bigger. There we go. I'm gonna move. Remember when we used to just have stuff? There we go. All right. And now this needs to stay on here. All right, there we go. So let's go ahead and get started. Jeff told you a little bit about me. I want to thank everybody for coming on. The purpose of this program, when we were first talking about it, was after we had signed the contract with the NJCAA to serve as the exclusive provider for risk management in Title IX. And so we'll talk a little bit at the end. So some of that is to let you know who we are and what we do and sort of what the benefits are for you, but also want to make sure we address, all right, you're hitting it in the chat. I think I'll do it this way. Mackenzie, you're going to have a list of everybody, right?
Yes, we can send the presentation in an email to everyone who is on the presentation today. Perfect.
So I will send it to Mackenzie and she can just kick it out to all of you. I purposefully and intentionally made this it's a little content light. It's a bigger overview picture of Title IX for some of you, because I do not know the experience level of folks in here. As Jeff indicated, there's a little bit about me, a background both in sport and in Title IX. There's other pieces to this that are missing. There's a longer version that we have at our website. If you go to the TNG or ATIXA or NABITA websites, you can see who we are and what we do. But I'll share a little bit more with that as well. So Title IX obviously is dominating our lives right now, and it has a profound effect on all of you on the call as well, given the new regulations, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Of course, the Title IX law goes beyond sports, and what I want to focus on, and let me say this, if you have any questions at all, you can do two things. One is, let me slide this little guy all the way up. You can raise your hand or just unmute yourself and talk. I think you can do that. Mackenzie, I think you're the host. I think you have the ability to allow them to do that. Or you can ask a question to everybody or you can ask it. Am I a panelist? I just realized this. Or a host,
Yes,
Matt?
you are a panelist.
Okay, so if you want to send a question to the panelists, you can do it that way, and we'll be the only ones to see it. I don't know if you have the capability in this one to send it to. Yep, you can send your question to everybody too if you want. So if you have any questions about any of the things that are going on, there is some crossover between the Title IX enforcement work and the enforcement work that's going on at Safe Sport right now. One of the things I know Jeff mentioned, I was on the USOPC task force that created Safe Sports. We wrote all the procedures, wrote the law that eventually created Safe Sport, and then amended that law later and went back. But I did go back and serve for about 7 months-ish as an acting chief officer for the center, particularly in the area of response and resolution, as we were trying to reconfigure the investigations and adjudications and writing some of the prevention policies as well. So I'm really looking at that lens as well as the Title IX lens, because they both can apply to a number of folks that are in sport and colleges. So, of course, Title IX is originally little history, but it covers two main sections. There's the harassment section and there's the discrimination section. And frankly, for the first 20 or 30 years of the law, the discrimination section got the most attention because it was really focused on admissions and financial aid and sport. So obviously athletics. Little known fact about Title IX is that it originally wasn't targeted at athletics as athletics opportunities. It was actually targeted at athletics as a way to get access to higher education. The law does apply to all education, K through higher education, all the way up to teaching hospitals and things like that. But the main focus of it initially was higher ed and getting access to higher ed. So it's always whenever I teach higher education law, I like to kind of make sure everybody understands sort of the genesis of everything. So this whole thing was pointed at trying to get women access to higher education. And if you want to really drill down on the godmother of Title IX, it was about getting women access not just to the first 4 years, but she actually approached it because she was being denied access to get into doctoral programs. And so the idea is we're trying to improve access for women, but rather than write it as a women's rights bill, it's written as a civil rights bill, which means it applies to everybody, and it's a gender equity law. There's a lot of really interesting stuff going on with gender equity. After the Bostock opinion that just got decided, it was actually part of 3 opinions, but Bostock is kind of is the main name on it right now. And that's the LGBTQ rights case that just came down from the Supreme Court that you may or may not have watched and paid attention to. But it's going to be really important for us to know that that is going to have a profound effect because of what's happening with that case, and then also what's happening in Connecticut with the CIAC sports case regarding trans athletes in competition. And so that is one of I think probably the best case that's going to find its way back up to the Supreme Court and sort of settle the LGBTQIA, and all the other letters, application in Title IX. Know that there's some legislation brewing in Congress that will also affect it, dependent on the election. So this election is going to have a really profound effect on Title IX, depending on what happens in all 3 branches. And so we do a lot of working with the folks in DC. Our firm has been working, I can say I have, and I know Brett has to a slightly different way, but I've been working with folks in the OCR and in various places on the Hill as a consultant now for almost 20 years. I hate to say it that way because that reminds me of how old I am, but that is, there's a lot going on. This administration has been very interesting. And one thing that Jeff is on the bio, but now I have to update it to make it present tense because this, the OCR and the Department of Education actually just reached out to, well, they had reached out to us when they first were in, and then we responded, and then we didn't hear from them for 3 years. And then just this right before COVID happened, they reached back out to me and asked if I would return to my role as a trainer for the folks in the OCR who come investigate schools like yours. And so I've agreed to do that. We're just negotiating on a couple of things, a lot of timing issues. So what that tells me is regardless of the outcome of the election, I'll continue to be a trainer for the people who do those investigations primarily on Title IX, but on some of the risk management and that like student suicide and how that could be gender affected, things like that. So that top box you see there, program equity, is really what that focuses in Title IX and sex and gender discrimination. This last 20 years, the focus has definitively shifted over. There's been a much more hyper focus in investigations and litigation on the bottom one, on the hostile environment and retaliation and quid pro quo. And so our group has obviously spent a lot of time in this space, and I'll share a little bit more with what that looks like. Sorry about that. Something just jumped up in front of and gave me a notification. It kind of threw me off, so I need to put that away so I won't be distracted. More distracted, I guess I should say. All right, so the differences between sex and gender discrimination is when somebody is excluded on the basis of sex, which of course is not permitted under the law, and then the program equity is the denied the benefits of or the access to aspect of Title IX. And then the bottom part of it kind of comes around officially in the 90s, and it's basically, because if you look back, I'm going to go back one on the slides. Oops. Right? It doesn't say anything in this slide about sexual harassment, but effectively why that sexual harassment provision is there is because sexual harassment is considered a way to discriminate against somebody and therefore deny them the benefit, or have them, if they're excluded from the program, have them removed from the program either by their own recourse or just, it's called sort of constructive termination or constructive expulsion or constructive removal. You just make it so bad that they leave, or they reasonably could have wanted to leave. And that's an important distinction that the regulations that just came out drew. So a little bit reminder that it applies not just to intercollegiate varsity athletics, but if you have intramurals and club teams, Title IX applies to those as well. The prong aspect of Title IX, the compliance by numbers, does not apply to those intramurals and clubs in the same way that it does to to varsity athletics. And generally speaking, we don't have as many problems with intramurals and clubs. Frankly, they don't get a lot of complaints to the OCRs, not a lot of litigation on it. Most litigation in athletics comes in the form of inequity, and I know that there is a number of folks right now that are paying very, very close attention to inequity in sport and are kind of chomping at the bit to go ahead and start to file some new complaints and or litigation based on what happens in this next 2 semesters, which of course is generally an unfair comparison because we're living in COVID land. We're living in unprecedented times. And so we're all trying to do the best we can. I know a lot of things that, well, you all have, NJCAA has officially moved things to the spring, with except for a handful of sports. And those are the kind of choices that are going to be examined because even though this may be considered sort of a one-off because of how profound the pandemic is, we have to pay very, very close attention to everything else that's going on right now. And so we just finished a webinar a week ago, 2 weeks ago, I don't know. COVID, it just all feels the same. Like people are asking what day it is, and I just say it's just day. I don't know what day it is anymore. So I think it was about a week or week and a half ago. But in any event, our mental health folks, and we kind of brought mental health, administration, and legal together to talk about not just the effects of COVID and the pandemic. And there was a great story in the Chronicle of Higher Education on the mental health issues around this, but also on the issues surrounding social justice and the effect that's having on our students, and Black Lives Matter movement, and what are we going to do about protests. And then we also had a subsection in there about what are we going to do about protests in sport, because this is clearly going to come up with our student athletes and our coaches wanting to participate in a way that perhaps they hadn't before. And what are the First Amendment implications of that? And what should we do and how should we be proactive? And we'll continue to bring those types of things out. We were talking about it in broad scale for campus. So we'll talk about that more in a couple of weeks when it comes down to sport. So it does require some institutions, and I hope I'm preaching to the choir for a lot of this, but just making sure that we provide those equal opportunities for female and male students to have an experience in intercollegiate athletics when we talk about participants and opportunities. And if there's any compliance people that are on the call, you're probably having a shake moment of, oh my God, he's going to do this. We're not going to do a super deep dive into this. I just wanted to give some oversight for all of you, just a reminder. And again, I hope for those of you who know all this is great and just refresher stuff. And if not, I hope this is a learning experience for you, because we'll get into the weeds in just a second. It obviously does not require, and this is where compliance in athletics gets really complex because it's not always an apples to apples. So whenever I work with you, and I've worked with a number of you already, you know that I always say, well, let's take the macro lens, then we'll take the micro lens, then we'll take the macro lens, then we'll take the micro lens, because that's how you have to do it to see where the holes are and where the exposure is. But there are some things in here that are really interesting about all of these bullets, I guess I should say, are things I hear from athletics directors at all levels, where they're like, well, Scott, we have the same number of sports that we offer. Well, that's not always how it counts, right? That's not exactly, and in fact, that's not really at all how it counts. And we get into travel funding and budgets and equitable budgets and spaces and things like that. The laundry list things, that's what it's affectionately referred to as. Really do that. And that's actually one of the things, I think it's on a later slide, regarding one of the things we provide, which is we do mini audits and deep audits, depending on what the situation is. But this is just your quick list of things that you don't have to do under Title IX. There are some of these things that we do anyway, but we have to do them in a way that doesn't cause us to fall out of compliance or to create a situation that might create that complaint where the analysis will come. And that's an interesting thing when we're talking to ADs and presidents and boards who are saying, they're like, we're doing this really, really well, but we're not transparent about it. So that generates the complaint that brings in the litigation or the OCR. And maybe we're doing that really well, but while they're on campus, they can look at anything. We might have some other gaps or exposures that we need to make sure we're addressing. And we'd like to be able to address those before we end up in a place where we're losing in court, as it were. So there is oversight. Some people, not everybody has an SWA, but because it's only required in certain areas, but somebody has one. But ultimately, I hope everybody on this call who is at a senior level knows who your institutional Title IX coordinator is, because that's the person who is ultimately responsible for compliance in athletics. Even if you have a compliance person for all the other stuff you have to comply with, and that person also gets athletics Title IX compliance, they would be what we would call a deputy coordinator. They would not be the institution's Title IX coordinator, I hope, right? Because that would be bad. I don't for any number of reasons, but you want the institution or your district, depending on how your colleges are set up, to have one Title IX coordinator and then a lot of deputy coordinators in other spaces. You might have a deputy coordinator who's the deputy coordinator for student affairs and athletics, or for academic affairs and athletics, or for business affairs and athletics. That's fine. Or you might have a standalone one for athletics, which is always my preference. But I recognize that, as Jeff was mentioning in the prior, I too, when I worked as an administrator, wore many, many hats and had a lot of programs that I was responsible for, as well as being a faculty member on the campus and the athletics liaison and the conference liaison. So there was a lot of different roles I was having to serve in. So this was just one of them. And so I also was an investigator, and we'll give you a little bit more statistics on that as we go through. So I'm going to pause for a second. No questions have come into the chat, and I don't see anybody raising their hand of the 200 folks that are on. So I'm going to keep going on. This is the part that I want to spend a few minutes on and just hit some sort of broad-based points. And I'm going to speak very candidly, very frankly. So if you're unaware, there was, just going to give you a quick rundown. So in 1999, there's a Supreme Court decision that effectively clarifies how Title IX will be applied to sexual harassment in education. And it gives us some clarity on when schools are on notice. It gives us some clarity on what our response might look like. And it comes as a part of two decisions, one in 98 and one in 99, one called Gebser and one called Davis. And those two decisions create some standards for when the school knows about sexual harassment or sexual misconduct. When I say sexual misconduct, just here's what I'm talking about. Let me just use that as a clarifying moment here. Sexual misconduct includes sexual harassment like you might think about sexual harassment: verbal, cyber, low-end physical harassment. That's what includes that. In our world, it also includes high-end physical contact that would be inappropriate, and also would include, of course, sexual assault. But it also would include stalking or bullying when gender-based, and would also include what we call exploitation offenses. So that's everything from sharing or distributing in an unauthorized fashion sexualized or actual sexual pictures or videos of somebody. By the way, that's by default unauthorized. You have to get permission to do that. Voyeurism, exhibitionism, all of the prostitution, a lot of all the other types of offenses you might find that are gender or sex-based or sexual in nature. So when I say sexual misconduct, it's all of those things. So in 2001, the Office of Civil Rights writes this, they called it guidance, but interestingly, it went through the acts that it needed to go through. So it's technically regulation. And I know some of you are like, Scott, I'm not a lawyer. What the hell does that mean? Well, the difference is regulation has the weight of law and guidance does not. And so even though they call the 2001 document guidance, it went through all the stuff that needed to go through to be regulation. So it is also recognized as regulation. So we have the 2001 regulation, which effectively says, hey, higher ed, here's how you need to handle these cases. And that was not very controversial until 2011, when the Obama administration sent out a Dear Colleague letter, which does not have the weight of law. It barely has the weight of guidance. It's literally just a letter that says, here's some things we think you should be doing. And that letter, for whatever reason, despite not having the weight of law or guidance, sent shock values, or shockwaves through particularly higher ed. K-12 was really not paying as much attention. And everybody started sort of revisiting what they were doing. I will say we had formed ATIXA just a couple of years before that, and our membership exploded. The people wanting to come to our trainings. I still have a little bit of PTSD from the St. Louis training where we thought we were going to get about 30 or 40 people, and we got 240. And so we had to make all these room adjustments, and then the rooms were too small and not important, but just know, boom, everything happened. There's a series of documents that came after that surrounding trans rights, LGBTQ rights, pregnancy, parenting, bullying, all these other letters came out. And then there was another one that came out that was effectively a Q&A on saying, hey, how do we actually do all this stuff? And that one came out. They wrote a love letter to coordinators. That's what I call it. It was really just a, hey, your job is really hard and we understand that and try your best. And all that came under the Obama administration. And then we had an election, and then the Trump administration took over, and there was a 180. And the thought process was that there had been too much emphasis on what the Obama administration referred to often as victims of sexual assault. And what they meant was anybody coming forward who says they'd been sexually harassed or was a potential, was a victim of some alleged harassment, right? So all of that misconduct stuff. And they felt the focus was too much over there. And so they swore they were going to change that and do the regs and write some regulations that would be different. They chastised the Obama administration for overstepping their bounds and not going through a Procedures Act and yada, yada, yada. And basically, here's what you need to know. There was a pendulum. And I'm just going to go ahead and give this to you much in the same way I give it to the folks who are in charge of this for the institution, just so you know what the thought process is. For a long, long, long time, there was this idea that if somebody came in and said they'd been, and I'm going to go with the worst case scenario, sexual assault, and I'm going to do something that is not very inclusive, but I'm going to just say it is statistically sexist, is what I call it, statistical sexism. And that is, I'm going to tell, when I describe this case, I'm going to make the claimant, the person bringing forth the claim, a woman, and I'm going to make the respondent a man. It can go any other way. You could have a man claiming a woman harassed him. You can have a man saying a man did, a woman saying a woman. I get all of that. Still the most common one we have is a woman and a man. So years and years and years ago, if a woman came to a college administrator and said, I've been sexually assaulted, that college administrator would largely take this tack. And I can tell you, I always get pushback from this. Not me. Nope. I can tell you statistically, because I worked in the field for a really long time and we've done the research. But what would happen forever back is they would say, oh my gosh, that's horrible. You should probably, do you need to leave housing? Do you need different housing? Do you want to withdraw? Because that's awful. And the women generally did one of three things. They either toughed it out, or they withdrew and then came back later, or they transferred. And then I guess I could say fourth, because a real small number of them went forward with the complaint, but not very many. Most of them, it was about, hey, you just need to go. And we can't really do anything to the guy because he hasn't been found guilty of anything or responsible. And so the pendulum was way over here in the place of, you need to go. That was effectively the message. And then what happens is around after the 2001 guidance is written, in between 2001 and 2011, the pendulum goes all the way over to the other side. And basically somebody comes in and says, I've been sexually assaulted. And, you know, Annie comes in and says that Bobby sexually assaulted her. And they go, Bobby, you're out. They do interim suspensions, which I've been fighting against my entire career. They would do all this stuff that was like, phew, that's it, you know, mere allegation. And what I referred to it back then and referred to it again when Me Too started, and when I was working at Bringing the Center, it's one of the things we really worried about was this idea of death by allegation. Just the fact that it's alleged that you did something wrong and boom, you're done. And we're going to come back to that in a minute. So the pendulum goes all the way over there. And there were all sorts of reasons they were giving. Liability, what if this guy rapes somebody else? What's going to happen? All of that swings the pendulum way over here. And then we got together with ATIXA, we formed ATIXA, and I was the president of the student conduct group, and we started pulling the pendulum back. And our thoughts were trying to get it to the sweet spot in the middle of thoughtful, deliberative responses that minimize the impact on both parties, focusing on the responsibility of Title IX. And so just when we thought we were really close, and you got to understand, when the pendulum was way over here, you had a group of folks who support the respondents in these cases, the people who are accused, who were very happy that the pendulum was over here. Yeah, she needs to go. Like, she doesn't have any proof. There's two people in a room. His shit, he said, she said, all that kind of stuff. And the pendulum swings way over here, and the advocates are super happy. The victims' advocates are like, finally, justice. And I'm like, no, it's not justice. This is not good, because we got to get it back to the middle. And then what happened was Weinstein, Lauer, Me Too, Time's Up, and the list goes on and on and on. And the pendulum starts to go back this way. You have administrators, coaches, ADs, politicians, governors, senators resigning on allegation. You have careers being ended immediately on allegation. And that's pulling it this way. And I talk to a lot of advocacy groups all over the country, and the ones that are in DC, and sometimes they get mad at me because they're like, good, it's not, we don't want it way over here, but we kind of think it needs to be right here. And my response to them was, careful what you wish for. Because this right here, in the wrong hands, what are you going to get? Market correction, right? And in fact, what this is right now, these regs are a market overcorrection. So what happens is they pull it way back over here. And so that's what you're seeing in these new regulations. If you're reading stuff about it, there is a lot of detail in there. There is a lot of detail. And I will say about 70 or 80% is stuff that we've been preaching for a long time already. But now they've made some changes that we don't agree with. There are 4 active lawsuits against the Office of Civil Rights about the regs. There are 13 attorneys general that are about to file another lawsuit against them. There's a group that's filing a lawsuit about intellectual property protections. There's just a lot happening with these. And then you also have, just so you know, Vice President Biden, and I want to say this because I actually had one of my clients, the president, asked me this question. It's the same president who asked me when President Trump was elected, well, I heard President Trump's going to veto Title IX. It's not really how it works. Title IX is still going to stay a law. The president can't veto a law that's already in existence. What he did do, though, is direct his administration through Secretary DeVos to market overcorrect. And so this is what it's got in there. Now, Vice President Biden, who has already said, if elected, will begin to dismantle parts of this. Meanwhile, over in Congress, you got some folks passing laws that I'm consulting with that are going to take some of the regs and make them law. So you have regulation and you have law. They're going to take it and make it a law. And then, but some parts of it, they're going to leave out and say that that can't be law. So that'll effectively render some of this moot. It won't matter anymore. And they're going to try to pull it back this way. And my fear is they'll pull it back over here. So I'm working really hard to try to get them back to the middle, back to being thoughtful and smart. But until that happens, and that's going to be a year out, if both houses and the White House flipped, it would still take a year to pass the act, to undo some reg. It would take a year. Vice President Biden could order his department not to enforce certain provisions of the regs, though that is within the purview if he became the president. So that's what's going on right now. A couple of these are really important for coaches and ADs because of how they affect particularly this issue surrounding reporting of things you learn. I've had a number of my athletics department clients reach out and say, so what am I supposed to do? I'm a coach and Now they say only officials with authority have to, report stuff, but my school's telling me that we have this thing called responsible employees. And the answer is that do what your school tells you to do. They gave a floor of who has to report, but most schools have it higher than that. And they do that for a lot of reasons. And frankly, what I really appreciated about coaches and folks in athletics is more often I was hearing them say, I don't want to not report anymore. I want to report what I wanted to report, as opposed to what I hear in some of these, particularly 4-year tenured institutions, where they're saying, oh, well, now it says I don't have to be somebody who reports, so I don't want to because I have these crazy bonds with students and they're like my children and yada, yada, yada. But the answer is institutions can still do whatever they want in that reporting element, but you're probably going to still be a reporter. And that's going to be really, really important. So it's, the regs are really adversarially written. I don't know if that's a word. Let's just go with it. But another big change is if you're not a reporter, what are some things you can do? There's a section in there that talks about you're not allowed to remove somebody from a program or activity on the basis of them being involved in a sexual misconduct allegation. So if it's sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, if it's any of those, then you're not permitted to remove them from any program or activity just for participating in the process, which is to say they've effectively tied the hands of coaches and ADs that if somebody gets accused of this, you can't necessarily suspend them. And by necessarily, I mean you can't as a matter of law, unless it doesn't fall under these really tight guidelines. So I'm getting further into the weeds than I wanted to. We can certainly address this, but let me keep going for a minute, and then I'm going to stop with about 10 minutes to go and just open it up to any questions you may have. So I want to spend about the next 10 minutes just sort of unpacking who we are and what this relationship is about. So we have signed an agreement with the NJCAA for the next 3 years to serve as your providers. Now that agreement is really between ATIXA and the NJCAA, but we kind of, TNG is the umbrella organization. So TNG, this is us. Our marketing people sent me this, and I wish it said stuff on it that was a little more detailed. But if you go to our website, you can see there's a number of things that we do. At heart, we are a legal and risk management consulting firm that works on the prevention side, on the policy development side, on the response side. We do investigations, we act as hearing officers, we act as appellate officers. We have about 200 clients that we have as retainer clients where they kind of have us at their disposal. There's all sorts of different ways people utilize us. So there's prevention, there's response, there's sort of governmental relations stuff I've been talking about. And then myself personally, one of the things I'm also doing is now working obviously with the Olympic movement in the Center for Safe Sport, but also about to start doing some assistance with the Hollywood Commission. And as I mentioned with the OCR. So what you see there, the picture, that's the 5 partners who work. There's 4 attorneys and 1 psychologist, and that'll make more sense in a second. So we do a ton of different stuff. You can find that on the website, but that partnership is broader than just sport, or it can be with your institution or not. It's really up to you. ATIXA is the Title IX Association. We've got about 4,000 members right now, all over the board, K-12 all the way up. The really funny, and well, not funny because it's sad the way it's come to pass, but the really interesting part right now is that before, no private schools in the K-12 arena were ever covered under Title IX because they don't take tax dollars. They've never taken any federal money. And then COVID happened. And after COVID, they all applied for, and almost all of them got stuff from the CARES Act. So they got PPP loans or EIDL loans. Well, now they've accepted federal funds, and now they're all covered under Title IX. And they're having what I know when I played ball, athletes sometimes refer to as an oh shit moment. And so it's like, whoa. And so imagine if for you Title IX coordinators, and imagine having no policies that you know whether they're legally compliant or not, and then finding out because they just made this categorical announcement to all the K-12 privates and charters, oh, by the way, here's a series of federal laws you got to abide by. And they're having this, what? And they go, oh yeah, and you have till August 14th. and go. I mean, everybody's freaking out on how we're going to open, much less what that's going to look like. Is that going to be full remote or hybrids? Much less now I've got to have all these other policies, because the first complaint that comes in the door that takes out, by the way, the hammer they have for this is give us our money back now, which of course that money's been spent. So there's that. So that's what ATIXA is. We're the group that has all the Title IX administrators in all these different various capacities. We've trained, we just realized late last year, we have trained over 10,000 investigators, both on the law enforcement and non-law enforcement side. And that's one of the things I do, train them in investigation techniques, tactics, hearing, how to be coordinators, things like that. And then the other group that you might not have heard of, because it's unusual to have somebody in athletics be on their team, but it's NABITA. And that's the other group that we started back in 2004. And really interesting story on that. When we started NABITA, it came to pass about 3.5 years earlier than that, when a group of us were sitting down wondering, well, I'll speak for myself, wondering why students were not being successful, because how students were not being successful because of mental health issues. And to be quite frank, I was the one who was asking this question about students who were drinking themselves into the hospital, students who were attempting suicide, students who were ideating at a really high level, students who were engaging in serious self-injury like eating disorders and cutting behaviors. And my thought process, not being a psychologist, I have a bachelor's in psychology, which means I know just enough psychology to be super dangerous. But my thought process was, nobody wakes up one day and says, I'm going to drink myself into the hospital today, or I'm going to try to kill myself today. You get to that point. And I see it as a matter of success and retention, that we should get them at an early level. So that's when we created behavior intervention teams. You should have these on your campus. They're either called behavior intervention teams, behavior assessment teams, care teams. But we started NABITA about 3 years later, and we created an early risk assessment tool that can actually kind of pick out when identifying marks and assess by the behaviors, identify a level of risk, and then give interventions that are appropriate for that level that can head stuff off at the early time. But we also have to have risk levels all the way up. And so Dr. Brian Van Brunt, that's the guy in the picture. Oh, this is fun. Ready? I'm gonna go back. Hold on. I hope y'all can see this. If you can see it big on your screen, I hope you don't have to guess which one the psychologist is. It's exactly the one you think it is. If you can't tell, it's the dude with the ponytail on the far left. I love me some Brian Van Brunt. He and I have worked together for a very, very long time on our mental health cases, on our most dramatic, and on developing the instruments like we talked about. So we developed an early stage risk rubric, and then Brian has also developed some more instruments, and I'm going to brag on him for just a minute. When you go look at this site, when you start seeing things like SIVRA, which is another name for an instrument, and VRAW, which is another name for an instrument, and now we've just developed a looking glass instrument, which is a different version. We also have an ARIS instrument, which is a terrorist issue. I'm going to brag on Brian because he does all the heavy lifting, and then we just help out. All of those instruments have now been adopted by the Secret Service, and after the Parkland shootings, by the FBI, because they're super early intervention stuff, as opposed to the threat stuff that most of the agencies have used when it would already be a threat. So somebody's got the guns and we have this really high level threat. We've got it at the super early level. So all sorts of stuff on the website for you to look at, just another resource for your campus. If they're not already a member, I would encourage them to join. We started these associations with our own money just to get them going. And now they're self-sustaining, membership driven organizations. And we're very excited about that because that's what our dream was. So this partnership between the NJCAA and ATIXA provides a number of different services and options for you. And I am like the worst sales pitch person ever, but I told Jeff I would make sure I outlined this. But these are the things that we do specific to athletics programming. So we do virtual and in-person workshops for coaches, athletes, all the staff you have in your department on a variety of topics. Up to and including some of the stuff if you're concerned about your safe sport obligations, as well as your Title IX and risk management obligations. I can obviously talk about that as well. And that can be everything from athlete contact, so like having contact with minors via text or phone, and what are the rules about that, not just for risk management, but for safe sport, travel considerations, both on the equity side and on the sexual harassment side. And then the bottom four you see there are stuff that we spend a lot of time on. That's just a handful. We actually developed a curriculum for the schools that I work with athletes, where we put them through a 2-year or for 2-year schools and a 4-year for 4-year schools curriculum of each year the athletes learn something new, and the first year athletes they go through a process so that they can understand where the risks are. Your school is probably already offering some prevention programming. We try to target it to athletes specifically because their experience is not like every other student's, and we do the every other student programming as well. So I know what it's like when we tailor it to athletics. We also tailor it to some other very specific populations, bands, Greek life, we call them closed communities. ROTC gets another one. Some of the other stuff we offer is offsite support and retainers, and that's on anything you might need in terms of being leadership. So you basically get our phone number, and if you need us, you call us, you text us. I know Jeff knows that, and then some of you who are on this call who are already our clients know when you reach out, we're pretty responsive, or at least we try to be. This has been a crazy, crazy time with the regs, so we've been a little slower, and we apologize for that. And then we have our ATIXA certifications. What we're going to be bringing to the NJCAA is we're going to try to somehow see if we can tie into the different regions and have small regional events. That'll bring 2-day, the certifying events. We will have a certification for it. Can also count towards some of your continuing education in a variety of different arenas. But it's going to have case studies and address a lot of that stuff we started this conversation with. And then I'm glad I put that on there, or I would have forgotten a little shout out. You get, oh, by the way, you get all of this stuff at a discount because of the relationship with the NJCAA. So you already start at a discounted rate. And then we're doing some sort of COVID pricing right now for our firm as well. Starting with this compliance in COVID land that we're going to be doing on July 31st. It'll be myself and a woman named Erin Bezubis. Erin is a professor of law in New England and is the author of the Title IX blog and is a whiz at the equity side of Title IX. That is her specialty. It is her research-based specialty, along with a few other areas of law. But she and I are going to be on there, and we're going to talk about all the stuff that's happening in COVID that we mentioned. So those First Amendment issues, the protest issues, the social justice issues, the COVID issues, what are we going to do with all the other possibilities of remote learning and the challenges that might bring, the mental health issues, but also the compliance stuff. We're still subject to the compliance aspects of Title IX. And then we'll also touch on some of the sexual harassment stuff that is unique to COVID land. And so we're going to try to cram all that into about 75 minutes and then just have a wide open Q&A. If you are able to come to that, I'm going to tell you that we're going to ask very strongly that as many people as can put a camera up can do it, because it's really helpful for us in presentations to see your faces. For those of you who are ATIXA members and attend our events, you know we like to have as many people up as possible, including on our publicly offered wine and nines, or 9 and wines, or whatever Brett calls those, where I think our biggest one right now is 1,300. And so just another opportunity that's coming up. I did include on here, oh man. So whenever we do a slide deck, we send it to our marketing people and then they have to approve it, not really for content, but for prettiness. And the way they like to F with me a little bit is this guy, because they know he creeps me out. This little dude is so creepy, I can't take it. And then they make him move. So every time I take him out, they put him back in. It's awful. Look. I'm gonna make it sit here for a second, and I can't help it. So I've also included my contact information on here. So if you want to reach out, and I will say, if there's something we can do, or I can do, as we're sort of navigating this, if you want to just reach out and say, hey, Scott, can we just have a quick call, to sort of talk through what we can do for you. Or if there's something like just a one-off question, just go ahead and send it to me. I know I'm talking about like retaining us and all that kind of stuff, but we try to answer every question that comes in regardless. And that is what I told you would be 45 minutes, and look at that, 45:51. I'll take it. And what I'm going to do now is just open it up. I see Jeff is on with me now. I'm going to open it up, and if you have any questions, concerns, anything at all, please, let's ask them.
Hey, Scott, if I could real quick, I just wanted to share with the group that we intend a specific email to all of you that have registered for this session that's going to have specific information. And we'll certainly work with Scott and the ATIXA team to include the appropriate contact information and details outlining our partnership, so that members have a good understanding of exactly what that looks like and what the process can look like.
Yeah, and I just realized Megan Burster's information is not on here, but she's the other big contact that we have for all of our athletic stuff. So thanks, Carrie Ann and Alicia. Any questions, thoughts, concerns? And obviously you can ask questions about TNG and the ATIXA and all that, but do you have any questions about some of the substantive stuff that's going on right now? Happy to answer to the best of my ability. Not all at once.
Well, it's been a long day for these folks, Scott, so.
That's true. That is true. If it makes all of you feel better, and I don't know if it will, I actually came into this and right before from teaching a class that is a 2-day class, which is really rough. I see Derek Mullins. You put your hand up and then you put it down. Do we register to ATIXA for the 31st webinar? Yes, you do. And so keep an eye on the website, and I'm sure you'll get an email about how to do that. Derek, you're back. Can you unmute, or does he have that power? Mackenzie? Can we give him that power?
Let me see.
Mackenzie, hello? Derek, we're trying to give you the power to speak. Hold. Mackenzie, are you there? Are you a host, Jeff?
I am not.
Oh.
And I cannot unmute him. I've looked.
Yeah, I can't either. Only the host can do that. Derek, you want to put it in the chat just to the panelists? We'll be happy to do it. You want to just type your question really quickly while we try to get Mackenzie to see if we can unmute people? And while we're waiting on that, does anybody else, if you want to put something in the chat, that'd be great. And know that if you put it in the chat, like only the panelists can see it unless you choose otherwise. Should an AD also be safe being the deputy coordinator? Yes, that's actually fine. As long as you can manage the compliance aspects of it. It's a little more common at smaller institutions when the AD is the person. Usually there's somebody else in compliance and athletics who serves as the deputy coordinator, but absolutely nothing wrong with the AD being the deputy coordinator. You just can't be an investigator in any athletics cases. So Mackenzie, do we have the power to unmute people?
I believe we can unmute
Or let them talk?
Individuals, yes. I believe
So,
if they raise their hand, we can unmute them.
Yeah, Derek Mullins was trying to ask a question, and I don't know if he's on a phone or wants to bring his video up or anything like that. I don't think he can. Maybe he can. What I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to stop the screen share. There we go. So Derek, if you want to talk now and ask a question, you can. Look at that. She has the power.
Yes, Scott.
Yeah.
Yes. First of all, I was saying thanks for sharing. And then you had went into one aspect with dealing with death by allegations.
Mm-hmm.
And then you also mentioned that it will be at least a year out, whether there's a change on political scheme. After that year out, how deep do you think the changes would affect Title IX moving forward?
Okay. Assuming a shift in the White House, they could go faster and that'll be it. So if House, Senate, and White House all flip, it's going to be relatively fast in terms of the changes. Some of the changes will be, if you've been following the regs, the live cross-examination is going to go off the table. The live hearing mandate is going to go off the table. Preponderance of the evidence will be the standard. There'll be some form of hearing as an option still. There'll be some form of people being able to ask questions to each other. But it'll also be a return to everybody's a responsible employee. So that idea of sharing information and things that you know and sharing just what you know is going to end up being part of the law. That's my prediction based on what I'm working with.
Right, and then you said thank you for sharing that information. And then you said you also be sharing, I think later on around the 31st of July, information in regards of the civil unrest that's going on right now. And
correct. We'll talk
protest.
about the impact on athletic. We're going to talk specifically to athletics and the impact on coaches and athletes and what's going to happen. I mean, this is going to go range from everything from social media accounts to open protests. This is I'll nerd this up for just a minute. This is a really exciting time. And if you are a fan of history, and I don't know how many of you are fans of sort of civil rights history, this is probably what it felt like if you were in the middle of about 1968 to 1972. Because what you have going on here is there have been some steps forward, forward. They're going forward, and now you're seeing sort of the steps forward, steps back, and now the reaction to that. And COVID, honestly, COVID, the lack of sports, the increase in the lack of entertainment on the whole, this has all created a really interesting environment for some really, really important conversations that are going on right now about civil rights in a way that they have not been discussed fervently. Yes, there is a fee for the July 31st seminar. I should probably know what that is off the top of my head, but I don't. I think it's a little over $100 or something like that. See, that's the stuff I'm supposed to do, and I'm really bad at the sales part. Karen's going to be mad at me. Any other questions, thoughts, or concerns? Happy to take them. I know you've been doing this stuff all day and have had a really long day. Well, I'll tell you what, seeing none, if you all want to jump off, feel free to do so. I will stick around for the next several minutes if you want to hang out. Oh, there we go. Our conference has discussed how we'd approach the national anthem this year. Advice? Well, do the national anthem. I think that's important. That if people want to lock arms or take a knee, right now, I don't. You've already seen the flip in the NFL, right? You're seeing the flip in the NBA, and what you're seeing is all these folks who took some really strong stances as to, you can't do that, we're going to regulate that you can't, are finding out that puts you on the wrong side of history. And I don't think that's where you want to be. Will there be pushback from boards or presidents? Potentially. But the pushback will be more dramatic right now, I believe, if you are to tell somebody they can't. There are definitely, so you can have some team rules and things like that. I'm trying to give you practical advice that the legal aspect of it is an interference with free speech. We can always talk about the rules that we have and we apply them equitably. So it's content neutral. We don't let them have any sort of social justice issues. I think this is a really tough time to be taking that stand, particularly given what's going to happen, what's going on and what's probably going to happen. Thanks for the question. As it relates to the prong analysis for athletics, those here indicated there should be any temporary forgiveness or relaxing of the standards to the analysis related to sports sponsorship. I want to make sure I'm hearing that question properly. So let me go ahead and say that for prong analysis in terms of participants and opportunities, in COVID land, if you mean by sports sponsorship, you mean how many sports we are going to sponsor on our campus, then yes, there's going to be some relaxing with an analysis of exactly what you're doing and are you doing it in a gender neutral way? Are you applying the same things to men and women? So I had a high school, it's still there. I have a high school on the East Coast who has announced they're suspending all sports except football. And that's not going to fly. If there's a sport that it's really difficult to not have people in close proximity, a lot of people at one time, football's really it. There are other sports that you can play that you could maintain some levels of proximity and safety that are fall sports. And by suspending those and by only letting one men's sport, in their case, boys sport, go forward, it's going to have a problem. So that action of saying we're going to delay this sport but not this one, they're still getting the same opportunity to compete inside the year. So you would be okay. We will definitely talk on the 31st in more depth about, because I know we'll get a ton of questions, which is why we're allowing so long for questions then, on cutting sports or reducing the competitiveness of sports, taking a sport. One person referred to it as furloughing the sport. They get moved from being varsity to club, but just for this year in order to save money. So if you're cutting or furloughing or suspending a season, but not suspending another season, the OCR is going to give you some forgiveness as long as you're doing that in an appropriate fashion, in a thoughtful and an equitable fashion. The courts will likely be the same, but I would rather have us go thoughtfully into it. And, this goes bigger than 9-2. So I know, I hope all of you saw you've got to think outside the box when Brown University, I think it was Brown University, it was one of the Ivy Leagues, said we're announcing we're cutting these sports, and that's going to happily make us compliant with Title IX in terms of gender. Didn't realize that they had to realize it, but the sports they were cutting were also the sports where they were primarily, they were mostly represented. That was most of the representation in their athletics department of African-American and underrepresented athletes. So not a good call there, right? You're compliant now for gender, but you eliminated African-American athletes from an opportunity. So that's it's a different kind of discrimination. We have to have it all there. Now they can't. With athletes who want to create unity, can we recommend that they take action together? You can always recommend it, like to try to be supportive to your teammates. That's always a good thing. I'm sure there'll be somebody who's like, I'm just not comfortable. And I think the recommendation versus the mandate, we're all going to take a knee, is a good play. It's a good way to go about it. My institution is revamping our sports offering. Is it true there's an acceptable time period to get back to meet gender equity? If you're already compliant, the one thing I know you're going to get forgiveness for is not using this year's snapshot of your enrollment counts, unless it ends up being about the same as you had before. So if you were 60-40 before and this year you're 60-40 again, oh, good for you. But if you've been 60-40 female forever, and then this year for whatever reason you go to 55-45 men, that's going to be seen as an anomaly year, just like it normally would. You want to take your averages. So this year with COVID and students taking gap years and students not even sure if they want to go back to school, it's going to be really interesting, which is why I've been telling my contacts at the OCR, and I've been getting positive feedback on that. Hey, these numbers, if they're an anomaly, they're an anomaly, and we're not going to count them. Just like we wouldn't count an anomaly year any other year. We look at our 3 and 5 year trends is what we really want to match with. Any news or info on EAD report change due to COVID? The report's not going to change. The analysis of it will. If you have a lot, again, with that student population shifting by gender, you're prong compliant. So back to the other person, if you're currently in gender equity by percentages and you revamp your sports to get out of equity, that's a really bad idea. Don't do that. If you're currently prong 1 compliant based on past percentages, keep that even if your percentages jack around this year. And again, we'll get into some weed stuff on the 31st when it comes to utilizing COVID to come into compliance. I think there's going to be some really interesting analysis. You'll also get to hear Aaron and I sort of go back and forth on some different viewpoints on some interpretation things. How are we going to register for the July 31? You'll actually get an email. I know Karen, who's our marketing person, is getting ready to put it up on the ATIXA website and the TNG website, but the NJCAA folks will probably get a direct email. She'll contact somebody at NJCAA who will send that out to you. I don't know who she talks to. That's really sad, but I try to stay in my lane.
Yeah, we can certainly, and what we can do, Scott, is we can include that with the targeted, for lack of a better way to put it, email that we're going to send following up with this group to make sure that they have all the specifics. And real quick, for those of you that are going to jump off at 4 o'clock, I did just want to briefly, I thank you, Scott, so much for joining us. I know how busy your schedule is. I can see from, as we suspected and expected, this was going to be a popular session, lots of positive feedback. Appreciate your guidance, your expertise. Looking forward to the partnership, and members will be sure to get some information out there. And I know Carrie Ann McTiernan on behalf, said this earlier, on behalf of the Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Council, But I also want to make sure to thank you on behalf of that group as well, because I know they're really looking forward to working very closely with you and with your team and continuing to add value to the membership and making sure that we're doing our part to address these issues.
Absolutely. Yep. Thanks, Carrie Ann.
And
All right.
I think that concludes the session. Scott, I don't know if you had a couple more minutes to stick around if you wanted to.
Happy to stick around for a few more minutes if anybody wants to stay on the call or stay on and ask a question.
Okay.
That's generally, I think about it as if we were doing this live, what would happen? Like the session would end, I'd be standing at the front of the table.
Yeah, in front of the room, right.
Put her out. Some people would be like, I'm going to wait till everybody's gone to ask a question.
Right.
That still happens, by the way, even in our online classes.
I'm sure it'll happen now. You know, I could tell by some of the questions that that some of the folks were asking, they were using some that they definitely work in this area. You can certainly see that some folks spend their days reading this stuff. The language is too precise.
It's always funny watching the number go down. The craziest one we had, Jeff, was that Wine and Nine that had 1,300 people sign up for it.
Wow. And
I'd not seen it. Yeah. We're doing baseball, which is champion short, and beach volleyball. It's a trial. Needed to suspend court volleyball. Is it okay if you're still offering? So if you're just doing those two sports, you know, again, we'll do that macro look. And the question then is, what are you doing by suspending court volleyball, which of course would affect more women participants than men participants? I'm assuming you mean women's volleyball. Are we suspending the season to the spring, or are we suspending it to next year? We're going to have a real rationalization if we're suspending it to next year, because there's a way to do that in the spring. And I think, Jeff, in the NJCAA announcement, didn't they announce that women's volleyball is one of the ones that is going to move to the spring, or is that one of the ones that's going on in the fall? Or did I just put you on the spot and you don't remember off the top of your head?
Yes.
I know cross country was going in the fall.
Put me on the spot. I don't know the answer. Actually, give me a second to get the answer to that.
Yeah, no, it's on the letter. Oh.
Yes, court volleyball is going to the spring. Men's and women's cross country will remain in the fall, but women's volleyball will be moved to the spring.
There we go. So there's your answer. As long as you give them that opportunity in the spring and don't just suspend it forever. Again, if you're moving on, if you're moving teams out completely, that's what's going to be a red flag. You know, because the thoughtfulness and the documentation will be a big part of that. There we go. Tennis. See, the members are coming in with the answers for us.
Everybody's playing.
Tennis, golf, cross country. With regard to sexual misconduct and removal, can we place interim measures to support students when the reporting party and the respondent are on the same team? You can. You're going to want to run those by your Title IX coordinator to make sure. I would say most Title IX coordinators don't understand how sport works. Most of them did not play at a lot of levels. I mean, they might have played when they were like little kids, but they don't play competitive varsity or collegiate sports. And so they may not understand how a track meet goes, or how a swim meet or a diving competition, like what's the setup for those when you might have respondents and claimants on the same team. So they may look to you for creative ways to keep the parties apart during practices or training or competition. And so in terms of the interim supportive measures, work with your Title IX coordinator and explain to them why you're doing what you're doing, because ultimately they have to put that in writing with the rationale. So help them understand. So if you have a Title IX coordinator who says they can't stay on the same bus, and you're like, we only have one bus, we can't really buy a whole new bus for one person. And so, and we can't make one person travel in their car because that could be viewed as punitive. So get creative, work with the Title IX coordinator. If you're struggling with any of those, of course, you can reach out to us and give us some more specific scenarios. We're happy to do it. You know what, I didn't even check to see if anything happened since my email address was up there. Okay. All right. Down to 60.
There's still a line of 64 people at the front of the table, but I just don't see.
Any other questions? And if you raise your hand, we can make it so you can talk if you don't want to type. If you type like I type, which is very poorly and slowly. Welcome. All right.
Yeah, it's probably safe to call it now, I think.
Yeah. All right, folks, I'm going to go ahead and drop off. If you want to reach out, you have my email address. We'll get those slides to you, Jeff. I'm just going to send them to you as soon as we hang up.
You got it. Thanks again, Scott. I really appreciate it, buddy.
No worries. Take care, man. Good to see you. Stay safe. Wear a mask. Wash your hands.
Bye.